Pakistan actually has provided a lot of support within the neighborhood. So in a sense, you are acting, even though you're not benefiting from the situation, but you're acting in a lot of ways as the relief provider now.
Assalamu alaikum everyone, I'm Michelle Mohiyuddin and welcome to this week's episode of the Pakistan Pivot. I'm here today with Dr. Aleksandra Berzina-Cerenkova. Dr. Una is a political scientist and she's also a China scholar. Currently, she is the head of China Studies Center at the Riga Stratens University in Latvia. Welcome to this podcast and also welcome to Pakistan.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I've heard very good things about your work, and I know that you have a very wide and young audience, so it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
I'll just start with geopolitical role of Pakistan. How do you perceive our geopolitical role, and what is that role exactly?
I would like to say that one of the main reasons for me to agree to this, to come to this conference, was the interest in researching and to finding out about the geopolitical and general role and the outlooks of Pakistan, the issues that you face, the logic behind the decisions, and this conference has delivered on it for me. So I feel I know much more, and now when I go back, I can tell about the things that I've learned. Having said that, of course, I know very little about the geopolitical considerations of Pakistan. So I would like to fall back on one of the speakers yesterday who actually outlined the importance of geoeconomic thinking in the development of Pakistan. I think what is important is that we all need development and that the issues that we are facing are wider than national borders. And that is also something that Dr. Usman Kohan, who's one of the organizers of the event, has outlined in his remarks. So I would like to say that the roles of nation states are changing in general because the issues that we're facing, and of course, it's the climate change, the pandemics, right? The food crisis. Something that we are facing right now in my region is an energy crisis that has a lot.
We will talk about that definitely.
So all of these things, they do not stop at the border, and of course, migration and movement of labor, of people. All of these things have very strong ethical and philosophical implications as well. Actually, we have to tweak the way we talk about national borders. So I think in that sense, Pakistan as a multi-ethnic modern nation has a lot to teach us.
So your main focus is China, and we see an intensification of the conflict and the relations between the U.S. and China. The rivalry is going in an upward trajectory. So how do you think China will approach this?
We did have a couple of Chinese speakers at the conference as well, and we see that China has an overall assertive approach. China's national interests are in fact rooted in its vicinity, in its neighborhood. Of course, we know about the South China Sea, but it is no surprise that during the recent years, especially so, Chinese foreign policy rhetoric is very much U.S. oriented. So blaming the U.S. for a lot of issues, and I think the trade war is only one of these aspects. But we also see it in terms of the war in Ukraine. So China sided quite strongly with Russia, blaming NATO expansion, blaming the United States for the instigation of the war. That is the position that I have to say I do not share. So we see that. And of course, in the United States also, we see that the hawkish approach is winning out. The security considerations are ever persistent. They're always there at every conversation. So the approach is almost you want to err on the side of caution, total decoupling. And I think in that case, in this conversation, the EU offers, the European Union offers a welcome balance, even though, of course, it is very aware of the risks that come with the China as a solidified state actor that also controls the businesses, and so with these risks. But at the same time, the EU is not in favor of total and complete decoupling, but rather is exploring what are still the areas where we can continue engagement, because it is engagement that has brought us to the situation that we are now economically in a good way. So, of course, cutting all engagement would be hurtful for us all. On top of that, of course, it's quite hard to, from a European perspective, right now, and also from United States perspective, there are currently sanctions on Russia. So basically, any economic interaction with Russia right now is not happening anymore, which is, again, in my personal opinion, as a person from the Baltic states bordering Russia, again, is justified and correct. But at the same time, of course, it is hurting the economy. So it is a trade-off. And so we simply cannot afford to have a blanket disengagement with everyone.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the dilemma, and that's the situation we're in.
There are talks of a looming global recession right now. So will it be a major contention between the U.S. and China, or will the economics take a back seat and in the run-up to this new Cold War?
Yes, economics always has a role to play in the looming recession, also in the cycles in the election cycles of many countries, right? So it is always something that the populations take very seriously, and it's always something that the politicians have to keep in mind. I think Lithuania was one of the examples, in fact, when they adopted a very harsh anti-China policy, and China and kind of turned a little bit towards Taiwan, and China retaliated in a way that Lithuanians didn't expect by targeting large international companies that were dealing with Lithuania. So kind of a secondary sanctions approach, right? So, and then that forced actually the Lithuanian government to think, okay, maybe this was too much. And then there were some information leak that the president even did not, said maybe we overdid this, right? So basically what I'm trying to illustrate is that, of course, economic considerations always are very important. But your question contained this phrase, what is it going to take a back seat, right? And of course, in a situation where security threats are very imminent, and that depends from region to region and from perception to perception. But in my region, then there is a logic saying, okay, this is what we're doing for security reasons, and we just have to kind of suffer it out, wait it out, live it out. So it's very hard to say, but one thing is for sure, the growth is slowing. It's slowing all over, and we're spending a lot of money on putting out proverbial fires in terms of security. And also there is an arms race, right? We're talking whether a new Cold War is already started or whether it was only going to start. But in fact, we do see an arms race. We do see an increase in the role of the military establishment all over. So, and another thing about the Cold War is that we were kind of, especially my generation, the late Cold War generation, we were used to the Cold War being this comfortable balance, that the proxy wars aside, you would still have some sort of a balance, and you would have nuclear kind of deterrence, and you feel like, okay, so you would have 1 or 2 nuclear drills a week, but beside that, there's no way that there's going to be a large scale war. That's the definition of cold, right? Yeah. So it was not a full blown hot war. And now when we're speaking about a new Cold War, actually, I think it's the wrong way to approach this, because this new situation we're in is not predictable the way the late Cold War was, right? It is not reliable the way the late Cold War was. So this is anything but cold, what we're entering right now.
And what implications do you see for the region if this gets any worse?
Region, you mean which region?
South Asian region.
Okay, South Asian region. Well, of course, we have the hotspot, which is Taiwan, something that is on everybody's minds. And of course, the Chinese leader Xi Jinping did not put anyone at ease during his speech just right now at the Congress. In his report, he did say that China's, and I'm paraphrasing, but is not given up on the idea of reunification by force as well. So obviously, even though it's nothing new, right? This is not some new threat level, but still, it's kind of a simmering thought that this is a hot point, and this is a hot point of engagement of the superpowers of China and the U.S. So that is one thing that is anything but cold, right? And why? What do we need for a Cold War? Cold War is, of course, not ideal. It's terrible. It blocks development. It cuts the world into I
think even previously it wasn't really a Cold War. The United States and Russia were fighting proxy wars all over.
Exactly, but at the end of the day, both of the sides were realist enough, and both had found a way to not go, against each other, and so not to escalate. And that's what I mean by reliable and predictable. It doesn't mean that people didn't suffer because of the situation. Exactly, they suffered all over, but there was certain political global predictability about it. But right now, when we see the standoff between the United States and China, there is no predictability. There is no communication, right? So there's very little. We know that the mill-to-mill dialogue had been suspended, and perhaps it's just a crisis, right? Maybe we are overthinking this. Maybe this is something that can be de-escalated, right? We always talk about escalation, and then we don't.
I mean, in the current scenario, I don't see it de-escalating. I only see it escalating.
Exactly. We do know, of course, about some. We do know about some. Attempts kind of behind the scenes to talk about this, right? We also know that when Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan, there were signals from Taiwan as well saying, maybe this is not the right time for you to take that trip. But, Ms. Pelosi was very adamant and said, no, we're going to do this. So, but what I wanted to bring, Ben, sorry for blabbering, but I have an idea somewhere there. It's well hidden, but trust me.
No, I'm listening.
The main thing about a Cold War, with all the bad things that it had, and I'm a Cold War child too, so I trust me that I'm happy that it's over. But it's a status quo. Kind of, the situation is not ideal, but this is how it is, and this is how we handle it. Right now, all of the sides are talking that the status quo has been breached. Of course, it's always the other side that's to blame. We're talking about the salami slicing in the Taiwan case. We're talking about the U.S. maybe stepping away from the strategic ambiguity principle, where you have President Biden 4 times saying, no, we're going to defend Taiwan. And then other officials come out and say, no, the American position has not changed. No, that kind of thing. So the status quo, which was the case surrounding Taiwan, and I remember because I went to school in Taiwan in 1985, so I remember very well what the status quo looked like. That has changed, and that is instability, and that is, of course, one of the issues that you refer to as what does it mean for the region? It means instability for the region.
I mean, I know it's not your area of expertise, but I would still like your opinion on the fact that, what would be the best way forward for countries like Pakistan, who are friends with both U.S. and China?
I think that first of all, of course, is the communication, because currently Pakistan is not perceived as a friend of the U.S. It's perceived exclusively as a friend of China, and I think that ends up hurting the position of Pakistan in that sense. That and it's about knowledge. It's about the necessity to also learn about what Pakistan's position is. And that's why I'm here, by the way, and that's why I'm very happy to be able to listen to these talks by top policymakers, by Air Force officials, by people behind some of Pakistan's defining policies, having them give talks here and explain these positions. So I think that a very big issue that is just that there's just not enough knowledge. There's not enough understanding, of the predicaments we all are in. So I think, but for a country that is trying to, that pursues kind of a pillared foreign policy, right? So this is what we do with China. This is what we do with, the United States. This is what we do with some multilateral organization. It's getting increasingly hard to be in that position. because of this new situation, right? Because of this crisis. So one way is, of course, there are actually two schools to this, two approaches. Yeah. And one approach is to define very clearly the domains. So with these partners, we engage in domain A, for example, security. With these partners, we engage in domain B, for example, economics. And with these partners, we engage in relief, ecology, the positive agenda, that kind of thing. Another approach, which is exercised by the EU, the European Union, to some extent, is a bit of ambiguity, a bit of kind of, not saying until the end what is it that we do with each partner. So let me give you an example. So the European position vis-a-vis China right now is defined by three by a formula that has three components. Yeah. So the European Union says that China is a systemic rival, a strategic competitor, but also a partner. So you have rival, competitor, partner, but this is kind of a three-pronged approach which can be applied to just about any direction of cooperation. So, and this gives, on one hand, it does show where the European Union stands geopolitically, but on the other hand, it does not exclude interaction and partnership, right? So that is one way to do it. Has it been a successful strategy? It's hard to tell. There are talks all the time about the EU perhaps abandoning this approach. It's been operational since 2019. And now we also see that national China approaches have adopted this. We actually see that this approach has been adopted beyond China policy, but towards any actor that, that you're not on the same page with entirely, right? So this is another school to make it murky, to make it kind of muddy, to not say things until the end. Again, one side of the strategic ambiguity. But at the end of the day, there is no perfect recipe, right? And of course, a lot of things play into this. And I'm a constructivist in a lot of ways. And I believe that, of course, it has to do with tradition. It has to do with shared history. It has to do with narratives, with perceptions, with values, with shared values that pushes towards one or other actor. So it's a very complicated question. But I do see from being here that it is being debated in Pakistan. It's being debated. It's on the agenda. It's being debated by very different communities, by the political community, by the military community, by the foreign affairs community, by the practitioner community. And that is, I think that is the way forward. Okay. And because if one thing Pakistan has and has in abundance is intelligent, motivated people. And that is an incredible resource.
So for countries whose geographical location puts them directly in contact with one or more global power competitions that are happening at the moment, what should their strategy be, and how should they navigate these waters?
Yes, yesterday, Dr. Yusuf, one of the speakers, a keynote speaker, excellently demonstrated how Pakistan basically is at the crossroads of three major theaters of conflict globally. So, and that is bad news, right? So all this intersects here. And of course, when we look around the neighborhood also, there's a lot of instability, there's a lot of hostility, and there's kind of very little maneuver space. And then also there's the history, the post-colonial trauma that is carried. So that is an extremely complicated question. I wouldn't dare to, speak on the strategy of what to do. And I think that's the role of events like this one, in fact. But I just want to comment that, of course, geography is an inescapable, and neighborhood is an inescapable aspect of analysis. So let's again talk about my region, and let's talk about China. So when we're looking at my region, a lot of things that we have achieved in the last 30 years after regaining independence in the Baltic states has to do with the fact that we are, in fact, positioned in Northern Europe. So it was in a lot of ways easier for us geographically. It is an affluent and quiet neighborhood. We are bordering Russia and Belarus, but at the same time, we had options, we had alternatives. And up to a certain point, we actually also pursued some engagement, economic engagement with these Eastern neighbors, up to a point where Russia became kind of more active again in terms of, its military approach. So we're talking post-Georgia 2008. That's when the region kind of started thinking, hey, maybe this Russia-oriented business is not a good idea. And then extremely so after 2014, after Crimea. But that aside, we were in a very cushioned position. We had these business opportunities and these institutional opportunities with our Western neighbors and our Northern neighbors. And we also had some links, expertise that we were trading on vis-a-vis our Eastern neighbors. That is, of course, changing now in the sense that we've, especially after Russia's invasion. But and so this is an example of how a good neighborhood, a stable neighborhood, and an affluent neighborhood can skyrocket a nation into affluence within 30 years, right? So a lot of things that we did, we couldn't have done had it not been for these for the environment. And I would like to also stress that we have no natural resources, right? So this is just the service-based economies, very little populations. So the Baltic states together is like 5 million people, right? 3 countries. So we didn't have a lot of hinterland human capital to fall back on. And still, we were able to do this because of the neighborhood. And now, when you're looking, of course, at East Asia, you see that again, the proximity to a country determines the development and the future outlooks of a country. Right? We of course know the position of Japan, that a lot of its security is tied with the fact that it borders China by sea. We see the same thing coming out of Taiwan, basically saying that we cannot, evacuate from here. This island, it is where it is. In that sense, I think that and I don't want to sound deterministic and pessimistic here, but of course, the neighborhood that Pakistan is in is extremely challenging. But it also has this other side, that Pakistan actually has provided a lot of support within the neighborhood. So in a sense, you are acting, even though you're not benefiting from the situation, but you're acting in a lot of ways as the relief provider. Now, of course, we know this, the refugees from Afghanistan and how you've taken them in, right? Yeah. In a show of support after 2021 Taliban takeover. So in a sense, you are faced with a burden, in my absolutely uninformed and humble opinion, right? So this is something that so it's a burden. It's a burden of not having good neighbors that help you catch up and develop, but at the same time, having to also help others who are who are facing even bigger challenges, up. So in that sense, I think this is kind of a double burden for your country. And that is why it's so extremely interesting what the discussion is here about the development strategies. And that is why we're not in a position also to tell you what to do.
Okay, do you have an opinion on how Pakistan can build positive interdependencies in the region? And also how can we bring down the power competition in this region?
Yes, I would like to again fall back on the panel that we had yesterday and the points that were made by the speakers on the power of geoeconomic strategies, and the fact that, my points are that my major point was that we should not overvalue interdependence as a panacea and as a magic wand for any issue, because it is not really a deterrent when it comes to really high stakes standoff. And it is not really a systemic change factor, so we cannot really hope that we can change a partner through trade with them. But what it can do, of course, is that it can increase the price for
There can be definitely
attacking.
Mutual stakes then in that scenario.
That is an excellent way to put it. Thank you. Yes, mutual stakes and just also human-to-human interaction. So more experience. It contributes to experience. So in that sense, now to quote my co-panelists yesterday, of course, there is always the choice between shutting off a border and shutting off every exchange over that border for security reasons. But also there's the choice, a geoeconomic choice of shutting off a border for security, but at the same time looking at whether these economic links can still be maintained. And I think that mindset, in fact, is a very beneficial one for Pakistan.
Okay, I'll just come to a completely different topic now. In the post-pandemic world, the world was completely shook, by the pandemic. And do you think we are out of shock now, or will the shocks continue? And how do you see international relations evolving in this post-COVID pandemic environment?
Well, first of all, we are sitting without masks. That's something, right? So we had a full two years of either Zoom interviews, or I don't know how you guys did it, probably also.
Same.
Yeah, well, of course. Yes. And either Zoom engagements or just being, absolutely, you cannot see if a person is smiling at you or what. A lot of awkward conferences there. And in that sense, we are in a post-pandemic world, in a sense. On the other hand, of course, as your question suggests, there are implications, that there are changes that the pandemic has brought about. One of these changes, of course, is a positive one, is that we've adopted technology. We've kind of, it electrocuted us into
the future.
Yes, exactly. Into tech-based education, into reaching people who cannot be physically there. That has opened up a lot of opportunity. And again, countries have been performing differently, but this also, and of course, there's always a divide. But at the end of the day, it's a good thing. And I think even now, when other challenges arise, we're able to adapt much more quickly. For example, now with the energy crisis, okay, so we're going to work from home now for 3 months, that kind of thing. So and second of all, it was also a test run in a sense. It was a tragic pandemic and we lost a lot of lives, but at the same time, it can get much worse, right? I'm an optimist. Optimists know that things can get worse. And we have had a very good test run for if we're faced with another infection of that scale, but which could be more deadly. Or
what we've mostly realized is how unprepared we are to deal with something like that.
Absolutely, because we had never dealt with anything like that before. And now we have protocols in place. Now we know how to act. Now now we see what the public debate is. I mean, at the beginning of the 2020, nobody thought that there is going to be such a strong pushback against vaccination in the West. Actually, if I can take you back to 2020, when we were planning strategic communications and thinking about how to communicate with the populations regarding COVID, people thought, let's see what the anti-vaxxers say. Yeah. They won't be able to say anything, right? Because the anti-vaccine movement was quite strong in terms of traditional vaccines. 6 months, year later, we see that the anti-vaccine movement is alive and well, and it's COVID related. That kind of things that we could not expect. You cannot expect them unless you test run them. And we did that. And now, if there is a second time around, instead of having Hollywood blockbuster scenarios of pandemics, we actually have a real life case, a global case, which we know how to act. So I believe that this has taught us something. But what does it mean for the post-pandemic world? And that's the tricky part of your question. And I think it's also changed national policies. We see that states have adapted different approaches to solving this, and we have China's zero COVID policy as one of these examples. And we see that countries have used public health measures for political control. And I'm sure that is going to continue. So we know that And it is a way to also tame people. You can say, you know what, you cannot move around, not because you're a dissident, but just because, we don't want you carrying around this pathogen.
Yeah.
So, and you cannot really argue with that. So the tricky bit here is that countries have become more closed. We saw that also in the closing of borders and in the debate surrounding the Schengen travel area, Schengen zone within Europe. So normally you do not take a passport, right? When I leave my house in Riga and I don't have a passport, I can absolutely end up in Madrid the same day without my passport, right? And then you have COVID, and I don't know what is the travel situation here, but I would assume that you also, with some of the neighbors, you have more travel policies that are.
We mostly need a passport.
Well. Perhaps I know that there's with China that there's a bit of a different approach to travel. Maybe it's for business visas.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to talk about the things. Yeah. I'm not going to fall into the trap of talking about the things that I don't know about. But just there are different levels of this. And then overnight, you would have countries closing up borders, countries hoarding on COVID equipment. We had Germany that did that, right? So no exports. No, we need the masks. We need everything ourselves. And then we were faced with this dilemma. What do we do? Do we close these borders? But we've been prophesizing the story of, brotherhood and open borders and free movement for so long. We've put it at the core of our values. What the Baltic states tried for a bit was to create a Baltic bubble. So yes, all the other countries were closed off, but we were facing similar levels of contagion. So you could still travel through the 3 Baltic states, and you could still cross that border, of course, because a lot of businesses are integrated throughout the countries. Like I said, it's a very small region. But it was a test for solidarity. It was a test for, openness, and we failed. We failed. So the world has changed in the sense that we've seen how quickly all of the integration and interdependency can be reversed.
So we were speaking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict earlier. As a Latvian, how do you view this conflict, and what do you think its economic implications are going to be on Europe?
Yes, thank you for phrasing it that way, because indeed I cannot disassociate my opinion of this war from my geographic, location and my national outlook. So thank you for phrasing it as referring to me being from Latvia. And so we have had historically issues with Russian revanchism starting from the late 90s. So in the early 90s, when the Soviet Union was disintegrating and we were about to, the Baltic states reinstated their independence, and then the Soviet Union collapsed altogether. And we still had Soviet army, remnants of it, up until 1994. And there was a lot of kind of negotiation over how to handle this. But then in 1994, we were able to kind of the Russia at the time kind of agreed to bring these people back. So, but then when Putin came to power in 2000, it was a speech, or he was in a leading position before, but he became president basically when Yeltsin said that he was leaving. Right, it was his New Year's speech, and especially during Putin's second term. Even though we had, like I said, business connections, we were very integrated also from a perspective of infrastructure, because our railway gauge was the same as it is in Russia. It's 1520, if I'm not mistaken, right? So it's in Western Europe, we have a more narrow railroad. Yeah. Also, our ports were catering to the Russian exports towards the West. So we were very much integrated in this, right? And like I said, we're a service-oriented economy, so that was a big deal. But then, as a lot of us know Russian to some extent, maybe not the later generations, but the people who have some Russian roots, for example, I'm half Russian myself, so I speak it. And then, of course, there was the older generation that grew up during the Soviet times, and they had to learn it at school so they could also follow. And what we started seeing in the Baltic states is that we started seeing that over the border, there's this rising discontent over the way how things are turning out for Russia, over, the fact that the Soviet Union broke apart, some nostalgia, some feeling that perhaps Russia's been wronged. And we were immediately very vigilant when we started hearing these stories, because it kind of meant that we're on the line. So I have to say that the Baltic states pretty much early on, so there was a small contemplation of maybe neutrality, but then very quickly it was realized that it doesn't really work that way. So the Baltic states started a very conscious turn towards the European Union and NATO integration, crucially, right? So, and we became NATO and European Union member states in 2004. And of course, the only reason for that, well, with the EU, it's different because we're part of the European, but the only reason from the security perspective was to protect us from Russia. So we kept seeing that there's something brewing in terms of ideology and perception in the Russian Federation. But of course, when we were, and Poland did as well. But of course, when we would talk, when our national representatives would talk at international events and speak about this, they were being shut down. They were said, relax, the Cold War is over, it's fine, different threats now, end of history, stuff like that. Even more so after 2014, after the occupation of Crimea. There is, again, an understanding that, in fact, it is still a challenge. It's changed, but it is a challenge. Russia is an issue. So in that sense, we see the war in Ukraine as not a crisis, but as Russian attack on a country that wanted to get out of the Russian influence sphere, that wanted a say over its own future, a lot like us, right? So when we were joining NATO, we were begging, basically to be admitted. This was not some ploy. So it was we sympathize. And that's why we've accepted a lot of refugees, and that's why the Baltic states and Poland from day one have stood very firmly in support of Ukraine.
So there's a looming energy crisis in Europe right now, and you also touched upon it briefly earlier. My question is that this is a direct result of the conflict that we also spoke about. So Europe has heavily relied on Russian gas for a long time now. And replacing the Russian gas will be a significant challenge for all of Europe. Do you think that Europe can survive without Russian gas?
It's a question of how we're going to survive without Russian gas, and we have to be able to.
No, but it's also coming from a perspective of what alternatives do you see Europe looking at?
Yes, it is. The question is on point, because that is what we've been dealing with. And we see that right now what we are doing is we're turning towards LNG. Currently, there's so buying LNG on the world market. Some of it comes from the United States as well, right? And we know the toll that takes, the toll that fracking takes on environment. So it's not ideal. We also know that the prices are extremely high. Another issue, of course, is the short-term and long-term impact on ecology. Europe was thinking that the Russian gas is a good alternative for kind of a transition energy source until we're able to fully, use renewables one day. But obviously, we're not there yet. So this is bad timing. But at the same time, of course, being so dependent on one supplier, it gets you where it gets you. Yeah. So at this point, something that I've heard, and I'm going to parrot some of my colleagues here because, something that I've heard is that we have, very simply put, 1/3 we can secure, 1/3 of the resources that we need for the following, for this closest period of time. 1/3 we can secure. 1/3 we can save. So just by being more, like I said, working from home here and there, putting the temperature down. Right now, we're saying that in public spaces, the temperature has to be 20 degrees rather than 22. Makes a difference, kind of take shorter showers logic. You know it, right? So that kind of thing, we can save 1/3.
But it's also a really short window to look at alternatives. Absolutely. Since the reserves are going to run out next year.
Absolutely. But at the same time, and then the 1/3 is the question. The 1/3 is something we have to, really worry about. And then there's this question about timing. From what I understand, the issue is not, it was a dramatic issue, but right now for this winter, more or less secure. For example, my country has an underground natural gas storage. We do not produce our own gas, but we do have this massive system of caves where we can store, and we also have enough capacity to store some for the neighbors. So this winter, it's going to be expensive, it's going to be cold, but the companies, and it's not about you and I either, right? It's about the fact that the companies, that the industry cannot go on unless they have this resource. So for this winter, more or less, that big question is what comes after, because this is not going to resolve soon, because now we've seen the attack on, well, we don't know what happened, right? But we can guess what happened with Nord Stream 1. We see that Nord Stream 2 is also over, which was always a geopolitical risk, by the way. But we see that these lines have been cut, and there's very, like you said, right? There's very little room for de-escalation here, and very little hope for that. So the big question is not this winter, it's what's going to come after.
And the sabotaging of Nord Stream has also kind of put a dent in any possible de-escalation, I believe.
Yes. It is definitely a big deal. Our Danish colleagues are, who kind of blew the whistle on this and saying that this was a premeditated, this is not something that just happened as a tech glitch, right? So this is very worrying, actually, and this is very worrying also not just because of the fact that I will not be able to, take longer showers, like I said, but the fact that and the fact that we have a huge population that's just above the middle class threshold, and they're going to be, dragged down under this threshold now. That they just
because the prices have skyrocketed,
inflation,
whether it's gas or electricity. And so, it's definitely going to have an effect on Europe's competitiveness. What's your opinion on that?
Yes, but then again, everybody's suffering right now, right? So it's the good news is that everyone's not very well off. The fact is that we see recession-like processes in every region. Like, just point at a region on a map, you're going to ask someone from there, how are you doing? They're going to say worse than a year ago. So we're not alone in this. This is not a specific situation for Europe. And of course, on top of COVID, right? And everything that happened during COVID. What puts Europe apart a little bit is the fact that it has still reserves for social policies to create a pillow. So we have, state subsidies. We have for individuals as well as for companies. The risk here is that we can become complacent and that you can create a vicious circle of subsidizing and basically smother the market in the sense that, drive it into the complacent perception that, the government's going to take care of my bill, something that's going to happen this winter as well. And then this money runs out because obviously need somewhere to take it from. But still, Europe is in a more or less good position because there is this resource. For example, my electricity bill this winter is going to be anything that's under 100 kilowatt is going to be at a fixed price of 0.16 euros, right? So, which is okay because it goes all the way to 0.56, 0.70. So I know that it's capped, but somebody will foot that bill. But short term, we're okay.
Thank you. Now with that, we will end this conversation. It was great talking to you. And thank you so much for your time.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
That was Dr. Una. If you like our content, do join us next week and like, share, or subscribe to the channel. I'll see you next week.